My name is Charles Jennings, and I'd like to welcome you to today's talk with Gabrielle Salfati. I just want to preface this a bit for those of you who are not familiar with the Christian Regenhard Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The Regenhard Center is an applied policy research center. It was formed in the wake of 9/11 to look at issues related to field response to large-scale events, in particular coordination between uniformed services, primarily EMS, police, and fire. And we undertake research and also sponsor, as you see, a series of webinars and used to be in-person events, hopefully in-person again soon, with researchers and practitioners doing work in the field that we think is important for our audience to be aware of. John Jay College also happens to have several academic offerings in the emergency response area, including a master's in emergency management, a master's in security management, and a version of public administration with a specialization in emergency management. And of course, the college has a long-standing offerings in the criminal justice area as well. So today, we're very happy to have Gabrielle Salfati with us. Gabrielle is a professor in our Department of Psychology and also directs the Investigative Psychology Research Unit. And she does a lot of work with law enforcement around mental health and particularly this notion of resilience. And so we're very pleased to have her today. And without further delay, Gabrielle, if you want to put your camera on briefly so people can see you. I will turn it over to you to do an introduction. And the way the talk will work today is there'll be the formal lecture that'll be followed by a discussion. And any questions should be sent in via the Q&A bubble, and we will moderate and get those answered for us while you're online today. So we look forward to the discussion, and thank you for all those who joined us. So Gabrielle, take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me start by saying that I am thrilled to be invited to speak to the Regenhard Center today and to all of you who joined us here today. We're going to be talking about a very serious topic about what's going on. I direct the Investigative Psychology Research Unit, and I've spent the last about 25 years really doing work to help support law enforcement by providing tool and evidence-based practice tools for various aspects of law enforcement, notably investigations. But what has become very clear over the last few years is that there's been a large need within the law enforcement community to really focus also on wellness. So let me start off by really contextualizing what it is that we're doing. And what I'm going to do then is give you an overview of some of the research that we're engaging in and also some of the practice issues. So let me start by talking about the situation that we have currently in law enforcement. These are numbers from last year, but they really highlight where we're at. Currently, we have more law enforcement taking their own lives than those that die in the line of duty. These are recent numbers just from a few days ago. So we had 236 suicides during 2019. And depending on what numbers it is that we are looking at, we have 148 officers who died in the line of duty, although the FBI have recently also just come out with a report in May of 2020 highlighting that there were 89. So depending on how they were measured and some of the criteria for that, they are lower. But what it still highlights is that twice as many law enforcement take their own lives as die in the line of duty. Now, we have about 18,000 US law enforcement agencies in the United States, but only about 3 to 5% of them actually have suicide prevention programs. This was part of the Rudderman Foundation report that was done in 2018 that surveyed the issue of the mental health crisis that we're seeing in law enforcement. There's a quote that I particularly like to start off with that was actually done by Craig Steckler, who was the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police in 2014, that really highlights why it's so important for us to have this conversation about resilience. And he said that officer mental health is an issue of officer safety, and we should treat it as such. From body armor and seatbelt use policies to self-defense and verbal judo training, we can all list a variety of measures available to ensure our officers' physical safety. But what are we doing to actively protect and promote their mental and emotional health? Sadly, in many cases, it is not enough. And in fact, last year here in New York, the NYPD police commissioner actually officially declared that we had a mental health crisis based on what we were seeing in terms of the sharp increase in the number of suicides and also the issues around mental health in officers. So let me do a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about the area of resilience, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that is and some of the work that has been going on here at John Jay on this to help us support law enforcement. And I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the extent of the problem that we have in terms of wellness and mental health in law enforcement and also first responders. And I'm going to be outlining some of the causes and the symptoms that we're seeing. But of interest might also be that we're talking about law enforcement, but we have many different groups of first responders and many different groups of occupations that are dealing with law enforcement. And so what I'm going to try to do is also bring up some of the numbers in different groups like firefighters, we're going to talk about corrections officers, and so on. And then I'm going to outline a little bit about what resilience is and how it can actually help support law enforcement in terms of providing them tools to increase their wellness in the face of adversity. And then we're going to start talking about some of the research that we're doing that is looking at evaluating the efficacy of resilience. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence-led training that we have that relates to this. So much of the work that we're doing in the Investigative Psychology Research Unit is really done with collaborations with law enforcement. And we have a tradition over the last 25 years of doing that collaboration with law enforcement internationally and nationally as well. One of the key things that we focus on is really identifying what the key questions are in terms of practice. And we use this directly to inform the research that we're doing. So our research is very much contextualized in the current needs. And one of our current needs right now is the whole area of wellness in law enforcement. Then we use all of this research to then feed in to provide evidence-led practice and training. Now, as well, in terms of John Jay, obviously our mission here at John Jay is also to prepare and train future researchers and practitioners. And students take the opportunity whilst they're here to actually get involved in research. And so the Investigative Psychology Research Unit is very fortunate to have a large group of research students who are all part of the MA in Forensic Psychology who partake in all of the research. And some of the numbers that I'm going to be talking to you today are actually part of that ongoing work that they're helping to support. So let's start off by talking about causes and symptoms in terms of what are the issues actually that we're seeing and why do we feel that we are having a mental health crisis in law enforcement that we need to deal with. So one of the first things that we did, we were actually, with the team, we actually reviewed a number of different articles to see what was going on and what people were talking about in the research literature and also in the practice literature. And again, all of this is part of ongoing work. So, but right now we have almost 80 articles that we just reviewed. And what you can see here, this is a word cloud that stresses some of the biggest things that people are talking about. And as you can see in the center of this, where the conversation is suicide in law enforcement. And connected to that is suicide as it is a result from stress, PTSD, depression, burnout, and many other issues. So these are some of the causes or some of the factors that I'm going to be talking to you today and provide some numbers to really get a sense of, well, how big is this problem actually and how is it affecting our first responders? So let's start with the basics. So we always talk about stress in terms of our work. And in fact, the American Institute of Stress have highlighted that the workplace is actually our greatest source of stress. And a recent report by FOP showed that 78% in terms of law enforcement experience critical stress on the job. And another recent study also shows us that about 70% have stress-based physical health problems in terms of law enforcement. But there's something about stress that people are not necessarily talking about and that we actually don't have a lot of information on, but which is absolutely critical because it's important in terms that we understand what causes stress, but also the implications of it and how that comes out in the symptoms in terms of wellness. And so I want to briefly just outline the difference between stress and burnout. And very often people get these two confused. Now, burnout is an extreme version of stress, but it is a very different type of stress, and the causes and the effects of it need to have need for us to look at it in a different way. So stress, which we're all very familiar with, is characterized by people being overengaged. So this is when you're running after the time, you're doing an enormous amount of time in a very short space of time. Now, burnout, on the other hand, which is an extreme form of stress, actually shows up as disengagement. And the reason why that is so important is because that signifies different underlying psychological issues that we need to deal with. Stress, people tend to have overactive emotions, right? Very high emotions. Burnout, on the other hand, your emotions are blunted and you feel less about what's going on. And because of that, you're disengaging emotionally from the job that you're doing. In stress, we see hyperactivity. In burnout, we see hopelessness. In stress, we see a loss of energy because you're tired, you're exhausted. In burnout, we see a loss of motivation. You just don't care anymore because you've disengaged from your job. In stress, we also see that it leads very often to anxiety disorders, whereas in burnout, it leads to depression. In fact, some people have likened burnout to depression on many of the different factors that depression highlights. The only difference is when it comes to suicide ideation. Stress, in terms of the effects on the person, can be seen as physical. So we very often notice stress in our bodies in terms of how it affects us, weight gain, the sense of, crisp muscles and so on. Whereas burnout, very often the effect on our bodies is actually emotional. And it's very important for us to look at these two things separately because they, as you will see, have a very different effect on what happens with officers who are displaying stress and feeling it, and those who have had such extreme stress that are going into burnout. There are also different things that actually leads to stress versus those that leads to burnout. And that has a direct impact on how we may be able to deal with it through resilience training. So let me talk a little bit more about burnout. So this is ongoing work. So we haven't completed it yet, but I did want to introduce some of the factors that we're doing. And so we started doing a review of what is happening in burnout in law enforcement. And what we noticed is that there's a lot of literature on burnout, but there's very little literature on burnout in law enforcement. And so it's something that hasn't been studied. But from the initial studies that we saw, so we did an initial review of 87 articles. We have many more, but we just looked at these. After these, about 39 of these are specifically on law enforcement. And across these different articles, they looked at almost 50,000 officers in total, if we totaled it up. And what we saw when we compare that to the general literature on burnout in non-law enforcement occupations is that the level of burnout is much, much higher. Now, many of these articles don't actually talk about burnout per se, but they talk about the factors that make up burnout, things like emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and low personal accomplishment. What we're also seeing is that our studies are actually looking at this worldwide. So this is not just something here in the States. This is something that people are concerned about internationally. Now, one of the things that we're doing as part of the research here at John Jay is that we're aiming to look to see what the impact of resilience training is in moderating burnout in terms of having an impact. And I'll be talking to you a little bit more about what that resilience training actually consists of. So let me next move on then to talk to you more about other psychological causes and symptoms that we see. But before I do that, I just want to bring in the whole conversation about the fact that we have many different groups. I'm going to mainly talk about law enforcement today because that is what we're doing research on currently. However, all of these issues that I'm going to be talking about, as you'll see, actually pertain to firefighters, corrections officers, and many more. And I'm going to be comparing it to what is happening in the general public so you can really see how these issues that we're talking about in terms of wellness and mental health really affects our first responder populations so much more. So these here in front of you are the rates of suicide per 100,000. And as you can see, they are much higher in law enforcement, firefighters, and corrections officers than what we're seeing in the general public. So already there, we can see, and this is where the conversation is at, as the word cloud showed, we can see that we do have a problem. However, when we then go on to actually look to see what the literature that pertains to those different groups says, we're getting a much more detailed view. Now, again, this is ongoing work, and it's based right now on about 71 articles that we've looked at, and it's continuing. But I wanted to highlight that just based on the initial work that we have done, the patterns that we're seeing. So we have a different number of articles per group that we've looked at over a certain time frame. And don't worry too much about the numbers inside each of these, but let me just highlight here. On the left-hand side, we're seeing all of those different psychological factors that people are talking about. Suicidal ideation, so people who are thinking about committing suicide, who are really at that very, very risky place. Ptsd, which we have focused on a lot over the last couple of decades. Compassion fatigue, which is about, what all first responders are subject to, in the sense that they're seeing an enormous amount of trauma every single day, and that will affect them in terms of the fatigue of seeing that amount of trauma. Anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Now, the first thing I want to point out here in this graph are these gray bars on the left-hand side. This is our general population, and as you can see, relatively to the other three groups, it's very low. It's still too high, right? But they're much lower. When you then look at law enforcement, which is the blue, firefighters, which is red, and correction officers, which is green, we're seeing a pattern happening here of the levels of these psychological symptoms and causes are through the roof. Now, the corrections officer sample, we only have very, very few. We only found 8. And so the numbers themselves, I would take them with some caution. But what it does highlight is that we do need more research on this specific group, because nobody really has focused on corrections officers. But we know from speaking to them that the level of stress that they are finding themselves in is very, very high. Our conversation is around law enforcement, but so law enforcement is blue and firefighters are red. And what we can see here, the numbers that we're seeing in firefighters are so much higher in terms of the studies that we found so far. So we really do have an enormous problem in terms of mental health and wellness based on the initial numbers that we have. But again, part of the research that we're looking at is to see what is going to be the impact on resilience training in terms of protecting first responders from these different psychological issues. And once they have the issues, how can resilience training help mitigate the effects of them and get them through this adversity back to feeling better and being able to engage in their lives and in their jobs better? So let me talk to you a little bit more about resilience itself and in terms of what it actually is. So resilience, the definition of resilience is the ability to recover more quickly from adversity. And resilience, it's actually it's a mediator for wellness, and it's a skill. Many people think it's a personality trait, and some people are, more predisposed to being positive. But resilience itself is actually a learnable skill that we can train people on, and it's actually not that difficult to provide this training as a proactive program ahead of time to really act as that mitigator from the effects of adversity. So the idea is the more resilient you are, the more quickly you will bounce back from adversity with less negative effects. And some of the benefits from having resilience is that you really gain a sense of personal mastery in being able to handle adversity. You feel in control, you feel you have the tools to be able to actually deal with the issues at hand. Also, part of resilience training is about recognizing your natural resilience, because many of us actually have it already inside. And then it's about amplifying it to know how to use it when you're getting into situations of adversity. Now, again, to come back to this whole idea about, are people born with it, or is this something that you can learn? Well, in terms of, so this is some work done by Lubomirsky on happiness, but it pertains to resilience and wellness and flourishing as well. And what she found was that about, happiness and wellness, about 50% of it is actually related to genetics. And only about 10% is actually related, is based on circumstances that you find yourself in. So that's the level of education, the amount of money you have, and the physical things that you have. barring, of course, poverty. But generally, actually, it has a much lesser effect on happiness than we think it does. About 40% of our happiness and wellness is based in our state of mind. So about 50% in total is actually within our control. And this state of mind relates to what we think, how we feel, and what we do. And what the research shows us is that it is the difference between those, that these three things is the difference between those who show resilience and those who don't. So what is resilience then? And how do we actually provide this to first responders? And how does it actually help? So resilience is actually based on 4 different factors. And it's based in larger principles of what we call positive psychology, which is the psychology of flourishing. And there's 4 different things that we focus on. We focus on mental resilience, emotional resilience, spiritual resilience, sometimes also called social resilience, and physical resilience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these 4 and just quickly highlight what we actually do when we train people on each one of these 4, and then talk to you a little bit about some of the research that we're doing. So physical resilience, this is something that most police officers and first responders are more aware of, because this is about your body. But from a resilience standpoint, what we're really doing is we're training people to understand the difference or the connection between the body and the mind, how actually taking care of your body can affect your mental status and your ability to deal with adversity, and vice versa. By having a certain mindset, it can actually physically not only just change your body, it can actually change your brain structure. There's a lot of neuroscience now that is coming out that says that we can actually change how our brain works and how we approach situations. But a lot of the physical resilience training that we give is about teaching people how to regulate their physical reaction to stress, so their stress response, that we all know how that feels, is the fight or flight that we get into. And all first responders are in constant situations where that is being triggered. Now, we are biologically made to have that reaction when we're in a situation of danger. And it's only supposed to stay in our body for a few seconds or up to about, a minute in order for us to deal with that situation of adversity. It is not meant to be in our bodies constantly 24 hours a day, but that is what is happening, and the physical effects of that are tremendous. So some of the things that we deal with when we provide resilience tools in this area is we teach first responders tactical breathing, how in the space of about 60 seconds, you can actually completely take down this fight or flight response simply by controlling your breathing, which is very useful, obviously, if you're going into a situation of stress and you're trying to, if you want, collect your mind. But we also know that when we're taking down the stress response in our body, our brain is more able to think. And so we're more capable of engaging in the activity that we're doing. Plus, it will also allow us to feel less stress and have less of that physical effect from the stress. And so we deal with this through things like mindfulness meditation, teaching people about sleep, exercise, nutrition, and so on. Mental resilience, this is about how we see the world, how we perceive the world. And because people will perceive the world differently based on their own value systems and their previous experiences, they will interpret it differently. So here what we teach people is about the mindset and how to think about the world, and how when you have a situation that is very stressful, how you can reframe it and become much more flexible in terms of how you think about it, so that instead of feeling that this is something that is out of your control and something that is challenging, it is actually something that is doable. So we're really looking at, I would say, it's like instead of thinking of adversities as stumbling blocks, let's think of them as stepping stones that we use as an opportunity to grow. And so we deal a lot here with things like worrying, catastrophizing, etc., which are some of those things that we're seeing in law enforcement because of all the other issues that are happening that are being affected by due to their jobs and the general situation. The third thing then is emotional resilience. Here, we're really employing tools to help people build their positive emotion. Now, why is that important? Well, we know from research that the more positive we feel, the more likely we are to expand our minds. We all know that when we're sad, when we're angry, when we're anxious, the world retreats and we can only focus on that one thing. Whereas if we have more positive emotion, it allows us to enlarge in our vision of the world and the possibilities. And because of that, we will be more flexible and we will be more creative in how we handle certain situations. And so as part of this, we also do training on how people react to activating events, things that upset them. and teach them techniques to self-regulate those emotions, because again, self-regulating those emotions is what is going to allow someone to be able to deal with the situation, but also have less of a negative impact that comes from all of those negative emotions. And we also know from the literature that having consistent positive emotions in your life, and these can be very basic ones, actually carries you through the bad times. So you don't have to have positive emotions in the moment, but if you have it daily, when you do have a bad day and something happens and you have a certain amount of adversity, it will actually be a protector. We also talk to people about emotional intelligence in terms of dealing with other people, and that is the public. It's also their teams, and how you can foster that community and connect with other people, because we know that the connection that people have with each other is also a protective factor in terms of resiliency. And then finally, then we have spiritual resilience, and we sometimes call this social resilience. And this is an area where, instead of looking at what we used to do for many years, where we talked about time management, and everybody always talks about time management, but it's actually more important to manage your energy levels, because you can be busy and you can feel, so this comes back to the stress thing, you can feel stressed, but it is when you go into burnout that you lose your energy and disconnect. And so we're providing techniques for people to re-engage with their work by refinding their purpose and meaning in why they joined up to their job in the first place, and really making them reconnect with that. And by doing that and really looking at what their strengths are and identifying them and leveraging them and leading their jobs through that strength, it allows them to reconnect with their work. And we have found that this is absolutely foundational in terms of getting people out of burnout and getting reconnected with their jobs. So some of the impact of resilience training, so what we see in general, so these are the boxes in gray, what we see in general is that resilience training correlates with things like self-efficacy, autonomy, problem solving, emotional regulation, optimism, adaptive coping, creativity and flexibility, stress management, increased neural structural connectivity. So what that means is that we actually change our brain the more resilient resilience training we get. And because we change our brains, which can be done in only the space of 6 to 8 weeks, we actually deal with the world differently. And we also know from resilience training research that it decreases depression, stress, and anxiety. And in general, resilient people actually do better in most areas of life. That includes work, personal, and health. Now, when we look at resilience training in the workplace, what we see is that it actually improves mental health, well-being, psychological functioning, and also overall performance, which means that people take less sick days, they check out less, and they perform better once they're in their work environment. And it also reduces compassion fatigue. Now, in the bottom right here, we have some numbers based on resilience training in law enforcement. Now, there isn't actually a lot of work on this, but what we see is that by having resilience training, it lowers the levels of stress, it improves physiological and psychological health outcomes, it improves organizational outcomes. So they become better team members, they connect with the organizations better, and organizations run better as a whole by having resilient people within them. And people who have received resilience training actually perform more efficiently during critical incidents, which is also important. We see about a 40% improvement in mental stress, 25% improvement in emotional vitality, and 24% improvement in physical stress. So just to finish off, what I'm just going to do now is actually talk a little bit about the research that we're doing to actually find out a little bit more about this resilience training, because there isn't actually a large number of studies out there that looks at resilience training, particularly within law enforcement and first responders. So again, we've done an initial review of the literature. This is by no means full yet, this is ongoing, but we found about just under 60 articles right now. And about 2/3 of them, just over 2/3 of them, are actual research studies, and then the other third is a literature review. And the research study includes both the initial research itself in terms of looking at how resilience training actually can increase well-being, and there's also a smaller number that actually does program evaluation to look to see what types of programs are actually efficient and how are they working. And as you can see again with the green circles, this research is happening internationally. So this is a concern, not again, just here in the United States, but actually internationally. And this is something that people are focusing on. It's really being on the agenda of many police organizations that are out there right now. And what we're seeing from our initial review of this literature is that a lot of the focus of resilience training is in the area of emotional and mental resilience, because that is really where we're going to have an impact on people's practice. So let me finish off then by talking about some of the research that we're currently doing. We're doing a number of different research programs, but there's one that I do want to mention, which I'm doing with a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Wiltsey at New Jersey City University. And what we're doing is we're working in collaboration with New Jersey police and law enforcement. And they've been stated a statewide resilience program that they have, and they're putting 35,000 officers through this program. Now, what we're doing, we're actually evaluating not the program itself, but the impact of the program. And so we have a training survey that we send out to people prior to the training that captures all of these numbers that we really need to find out more about. They go through a 2-day training by New Jersey, and then 6 months later, we catch up with them again. And we've just gone through our first round, and some of the things that we are gathering are actually a better sense of the actual impact numbers of all of these mental health issues in law enforcement offices, which we actually don't know enough about in terms of the literature. Also getting a sense of what exact adversities people are facing. So this time around, we're also including things like COVID, the protests, the riots, and the defunding. So we're really seeing the impact this is having on law enforcement all around. And then we're also looking to see how they've actually used the training that they got on resilience and what kinds of tools that they're actually engaging in. So, okay, then, to finish up, this is my last slider. So I just want to take all of this together and put everything that we've talked about into together. So what is our research and practice program all about? Well, the first thing that we're doing, this is what I've gone through today, is really understanding the research and practice that we already know about right now. So we're doing a full review of everything that has been done in the area of resilience in first responders. We're also then trying to gain a little bit more understanding of the context that we're working in through the surveys that we are distributing to various police organizations about the exact level of mental health issues that we're seeing, some of the adversities and what types of adversities that people are dealing with, so we can use that to tailor our programs and to see just how much resilience people already have. Then we put people through various trainings. It's either other people's trainings or our trainings, and we then look to integrate the research that we've done on the review and the context into that training so that it really is evidence-based training. And then we're going to compare different groups that we've talked about today, law enforcement, firefighters, as well as corrections. And then ultimately, we're then looking at the impact, and we follow up with people 3, 6, 12 months later and find out how did that resilience training actually impact them, how are they doing? And specifically, we're interested to see how are they applying these tools that they've learned and what are they actually using. So that brings me to the end of the talk. Thank you very much. I have some information up here, and I'll post it as well in the chat box if we can, in terms of how to contact us, but you can find us online. And if you're interested about the research or the training, or feel free to email me or find me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.
All right, Gabrielle, that was great. And for those who are online, we will send the contact information out via email. And so, Gabrielle, if you want to pull the slides down so we can see our faces, or I should say your face, better than mine most days.
I'm sorry, I went a little bit over, but we have so much to share.
No, absolutely. There's a lot there. And of course, I've already got questions starting to come in, so please feel free to put those in and we will get to them. So I think the first thing, and there's so much here, and as we've spoken, it's such an important topic. And as a former law enforcement administrator, public safety administrator, and first responder myself, these topics are so central. And many of our issues we run into in terms of employees or bad outcomes in the field, very often there's some, psychological component underlying a bad interaction or a bad outcome, that either it's a human resource issue or it's a public relations issue or worse. So I think there's a lot of importance here, not just for the individual well-being of the officer, which is obviously enough, but also organizationally and operationally. So I know you finished up by talking about your research, but I'd like to get a little more information on that. And namely, what's the status of that research in terms of your work, and how much longer do you have in this project, and when, what do you see coming out of it?
Right. So one of the projects, the one I'm doing with my colleague, Dr. Wiltsey, so the training that they started rolling out, so New Jersey is actually rolling out They're training to 35,000 officers, so every single sworn officer in New Jersey state. And they started rolling this out in March. And the first wave of training went out to the trainers. So they trained what they call the Masters Resilience Trainers. And they were tasked with training another level of trainers, the research officers, who are again going to be tasked with training everybody else. And so we're at this stage right now where we have collected all of the data from the master trainers who did the training, and it's now been 6 months. And interestingly, the training actually finished the day that we went into lockdown for COVID. So it was just in time. So one of the things that we added last minute was actually measures on things like COVID. How did the officers deal with COVID? How do they deal with the protests, the riots, and then on top of that, the defunding? And we're just actually in the middle now of analyzing those results. But what we're really hoping to gather, because we're not doing the program, they have their own resilience program that they're doing. What we're doing is more using this as a collaboration to finally get some numbers that help us understand the extent of the problem. So because we're giving everybody a survey prior to the training that measures all of these things that I've just talked about, compassion fatigue, burnout, and many other things, it will get us a real sense of what the size of the problem is. Then they go through the resilience program. And then what we want to know is, based on people who had different levels of wellness to start off with, or lack of wellness, or less wellness, or psychological issues, how do they fare? How is that impacted by the resilience training? And so we're literally running that analysis right now. So stay tuned. And then what we're hoping is that over the next 2 years, we're going to do several iterations of cohorts, and we're going to build up that. So that is one part of the research. But what we're also doing here at John Jay, we're actually developing, or we have developed, a resilience program. This resilience program is very much based on the evidence, not only of the field of positive psychology, which underpins resilience training, but it's also very different in the sense that what we're doing, all this research that we're doing with law enforcement, we're using that to feed into the training, so that what we pick to train law enforcement officers on are the things that they themselves are saying that they feel that they need support with. So we're really making it practitioner focused in that sense. And so we're developing that, and we're rolling that out currently with several law enforcement organizations. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to evaluate how this training that we have, so we're evaluating the training itself and how it impacts, so that we can really feed the research back in again and continuously, if you want, tweak it so that it gets more and more effective. And we're really targeting in on the things that are the most effective, that actually the people out there say that they need, not what I think that they need.
Okay, that sounds great. And so this sounds like a wonderful study design. And it's always good to see, although we don't see nearly enough, where you're doing research with direct policy relevance built in to the study. And do you want to talk just a little bit before we get into the nitty-gritty about the relationship with the law enforcement organizations and how that comes to be? Because obviously, well, not necessarily obviously, usually academics are viewed with a fair amount of suspicion, to put it kindly, by most first responder organizations. And so how did you manage this accomplishment of being able to work directly with law enforcement on a scale that you're doing?
Well, I think it's really about how, as a researcher, you situate yourself. To me, I mean, I've been working with law enforcement for over 25 years. So I have a history of working with law enforcement with a number of agencies, both training agencies as well as, national and international organizations. So there's already a background there, and they've seen through the training courses that we've previously put out the usefulness of this. And it's always been done as a collaboration. I'm very, in the Investigative Psychology Research Unit, pretty much everything that we do is done as a collaboration with practitioners. I don't believe in going in from the outside and saying what they need. To me, what is most important is also to get the buy-in, but it's really to listen. It's actually a resilience skill. But you actually listen to what their needs are. So ask the questions first. what's the situation? What are you experiencing right now? What are your challenges? How can I help? And so rather than going in, so I think with that sort of perspective, you're gaining much more of a collaboration because you're doing it together. I'm not coming in from the outside, even though, I'm not law enforcement, I'm academia, but I serve law enforcement. And by making that clear that we're there to support, I think it gets you that engagement from law enforcement. I personally actually haven't had an issue with working with law enforcement, and I have seen a tremendous support from law enforcement in terms of them wanting to get involved in training, having researchers work with them in making things better. And I think this really shows their commitment to making a difference. And I think for us as, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, our mission is also to support the, practitioners across the board in the criminal justice system. And for me, that's law enforcement and first responders. And so I think having that as a conversation and really listening to the needs, then we work together. And I think that is what helps get this off the ground. When I was originally trained as a student many decades ago, I remember when I trained and I had a fantastic mentor, half the class were police officers and half the class were students. And we started off being quite different in terms of how we approach things. And by the end of that, at the time of my master's course of investigative psychology, at the end of it, we were all the same, and we'd all sort of fused into one bigger whole. And I think that has stayed with me. And I think that's really the ethos behind investigative psychology, this collaboration. I think it's the only way forward, really.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start taking some questions because they're building up here, and I'm going to try to weave them into our discussion. And I think it's somewhat related to what we just discussed, but it comes from, I presume, from the UK. It says, how do you overcome what in the UK is known as canteen culture and the macho attitude? And so the mindset of first responders, and I'm starting to get into the more senior age cohort, and so I certainly remember the way things were, but the mind of the law enforcement officer today, how are they receptive? How do you overcome any resistance they might have to even talking about mental health?
I think it's interesting because a lot of people talk about the resistance in law enforcement and the macho culture, but there's also been a greater societal culture in general. You just don't talk about mental health. It's not talked. You can talk about physical health. If you're off sick because you've broken a leg, it's one thing, but if you're off sick because you're depressed, you just don't talk about it. But I think society, slowly, we're still not completely there, but there's definitely been a shift in focusing on mental health and making that a positive thing. And there's a whole wellness culture now that is out there. So already the context in which all of us are in has shifted. Now, within the first responder culture, there is definitely a culture of, I'm hard, I need to cope. And part of that is true. They do need to stay on the job, etc. But I think that there has been a shift as well in terms of how it's being seen. But that shift has been partly because they have seen what is happening, and because we're talking about it. And because this is coming from the highest level, so the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Commissioner of NYPD, and many other of the big city police forces, their chiefs are talking about wellness and how important it is. And so I think because the conversation is coming down from that, it makes it okay, because ultimately it's a leadership issue. And so if it comes from that, it means it's okay. And part of resilience training is to change the conversation and change the reference point. So if everybody's been through resilience training and everybody now has new words that they can use that they've all experienced together and they know what it is. So it's not some people have done it and some people haven't. They now have a common reference point. And so like any kind of conversation, when anybody has something in common, they will use it. And so again, it becomes part of the normal conversation. And I think there's a shift that way. But also, I think the way that we're delivering training, and I'm not just talking about me, but many other training delivers out there, all the way from yoga to meditation, all of those things that we would think, be very tree hugging. they've actually embraced it. I mean, we have, yoga and meditation for firefighters, and they do this in the firehouses. We have it for law enforcement because they have been shown the effects it can have, and it's been made okay. And sometimes, when you laugh about things and it becomes like a thing that you do, it's not so highly pressured. So it's definitely moving in that direction. And I think to answer the question that we have on that, I think the way leadership deals with this, the way leadership prioritizes this for their organizations is key. And I also think that once we build up resilient people within organizations, resilient people make for resilient organizations, and resilient organizations then change their culture. So it's a stepwise system. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think that right now we are on a steep curve simply because of the situation that we find ourselves in, where mental health is now on everybody's agenda because, COVID, we're all stuck inside, etc. So everybody has had some kind of experience of it.
Right. And I guess in terms of the uptake of the program, how are departments participating? Do they self-select, or is this mandated training? How does that work?
So I think it's different how each organization is rolling this out. And I think it is also depends on how they're doing it, whether it's coming really from the top level or whether it's coming from within the wellness unit. And actually, a lot of the wellness units, the people working with them, they often have a psychologist, yes, but a lot of them are actually police officers. And so police officers will talk to other police officers. Like, that's why peer support works so well when police or law enforcement reach out to other law enforcement because they feel understood. They feel that they'll understand them better. And I think so having them part of that conversation, again, is absolutely crucial. So I think some departments are mandating it. So New Jersey mandated it for everybody. They're like, we have an issue. We're taking it seriously. We want everybody to be safe. Other people are also mandating it in some of the big cities. Other places are making it voluntary. This is an ongoing discussion in terms of what's going to be better received, if something is a must, if something is voluntary, and also how these services are being made available to people. I think this is it's very new. We're really talking about something that has only started being rolled out in the last 12 months in various places. And so the conversation is still very young. And I think we need more people involved in that conversation.
And have you had any, formal interaction or reaction from labor organizations? I know you're dealing with largely unionized workforce in New Jersey, right?
So yes, I was invited to speak at the Fraternity of Police back in February in Nashville. They had their first ever wellness conference in Nashville, and the room was full. And so obviously this is this is your rank and file. And the conversation was extremely interesting. One, because an organization that is that large, that is launching, they even employed a director of wellness to lead this. She actually was here at John Jay. And so we talked a lot about this. And I think that they are particularly stressing. They're actually the ones who did one of the largest surveys with law enforcement to find out how law enforcement feeling right now. What are, what is it that's on their minds? What are some of the issues that they want tackled? And I think they have one of the largest surveys and people responded because, again, it was part of an organization that they felt was important. And so I think that they are actually at the forefront of this, from my experience right now, and trying to protect officers and making sure that we provide the kind of support that officers need. Obviously, I've not spoken to all of them. We have many different organizations for different forces, right? But I think that it's definitely on the agenda. And I think the fact that an organization that large created a wellness unit and created a director and is now going to be, is actually having conferences and training opportunities for their members says an enormous amount.
Okay. We have a question here on evaluation measures that you're going to be using. And I guess some of this is, I think you've already answered, but if you want to talk a little bit more about how you're evaluating the programs.
So This has been an interesting journey because obviously a lot of research done on things like well-being, psychological factors, resilience, burnout, has worked with non-law enforcement and non-first responder populations. So as this is why I wanted to do this review. And I really want to encapsulate everything that has been done out there and provide this as a white paper to people to access, to get a sense of what do we actually know, what works, and what should we be careful about and what do we need to build on. And one thing that I was very keen on doing when I was doing this review, which we're just about getting to finishing now, is getting a sense of what has been done in the general population and what has worked in terms of the measures and why, and do these apply to law enforcement? Are they asking the questions that are relevant to law enforcement? And so I went about picking specific measures that I feel are useful. But what we've actually done is we've doubled up on most of the measures. So we're, burnout, we're measuring it in different ways. Resilience, we're measuring it in different ways. And what we're about to do over the next few months is compare these different measures in terms of which one captures the issues the best for law enforcement, and then making a recommendation about which ones are, at least for us, which one works to take forward. And I'll be putting all of this, I'll be making all of this available to people, because what I really want is, that this can help both researchers and practitioners put things in place. And so we don't have the results from that yet, but we have done a thorough review looking at what has been used previously, what has been used most, what applies to law enforcement, and what do we need to tweak, and taking that forward. And we're actually starting that analysis in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm hoping to have that early spring available to share with people. Okay. And provide any assistance that I can. With anybody else doing work in this area, I'm happy to help, because I think that we all need to. It's huge, and I think that we need to work together in partnership because ultimately our goal is the same. Our goal is to provide support to the people. I always say, we're helping the people who are helping us, and we have to keep them safe because they keep us safe.
Mm-hmm. And now in terms of the evaluation, it sounds like you're primarily relying on self-reported measures from the participants of the program. Have you given any thought, or are there any plans or ideas about potentially looking at kind of broader level impacts, maybe like organizational impacts like sick leave, or probably complaints is probably not that sensitive, because hopefully the numbers are small in most entities, but things like sick leave or things like that?
We're actually measuring some of that in our survey. Not a great deal, but we are measuring things like, how often have they gone out sick? We're measuring, dissatisfaction with work. There's a whole part of our burnout measure that actually specifically measures what aspects of work is leading to the burnout. And so we're really getting to my background actually originates in organizational psychology. So I'm very interested in these organizational factors. And I think that we can't take the people out of the organizations. Just like organizations, you have to think about the individuals who are within them. It's really a package deal, right? Mm-hmm. We need to deal with it at many different levels. Now, there's something else that you mentioned. And so I'm hoping to expand that definitely. Right now, we're just focusing on the officers themselves to get that, and then we're building up from there. But we have some initial measures, at least, to see whether this is a direction that we need to go in. But you mentioned something else that was very important, is a lot of what we do is self-report, because, we want to maintain people's confidentiality, etc. And I'm not a neuroscientist nor a biologist, even though I used to love biology at school. But we're not doing the physical measurements of how is resilience impacting people's bodies, which we know is huge. That is a really, really important, and it's a physical measure, so it's really tangible. But however, there are actually researchers doing this, and they're doing tremendous work. Really, I've heard them speak about the program that they have. They're equipping people with vests that they wear 24/7 that measures their all aspects of what is going on in their bodies, in response to training, in response to trauma, in response to stress, to really capture that. And I think combining the psychological piece, I'm a psychologist, so I will focus on the, the emotional, the mental piece, but the mind-body connection, we're finding out more and more in the general literature, it is huge, and it has an absolute tremendous impact on people's wellness. And we know the second brain is your stomach now. We know that, so how nutrition affects your ability to think. There's a direct link. How we calm our brains down affects the way we think and the way that we feel. And so I think that it needs to be a multidisciplinary approach to this, so that, and I would encourage a lot of people to get involved in this type of research. And more people are doing things and have been doing things well before I have, and have really established some groundbreaking work that the rest of us are using to build from.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just reiterate, we have a couple of questions waiting, but we're happy to get more. And I guess a question that came up with someone asked in terms of review of the literature, has there been anything done along these lines with emergency medical services personnel that you've encountered in the literature?
Yes. There are things with emergency medical personnel, and actually a lot of the burnout literature originally has been done with nurses and doctors. That's where it comes from. Mm-hmm. Now we have that literature. It is sitting there waiting to get done. If anybody wants to help us, we would welcome it. And this is why, it's so tremendous to have our students involved. They're going out there to be our future practitioners, and they're being involved in the research, which really helps them then bring out all of this into the world when they themselves integrate various organizations with that knowledge, which is great. There is definitely work out there. I haven't yet looked at it, but we have it. We have a folder. Mm-hmm. But it's another category. It's just like corrections. Not a lot has been done. And we've had a real challenge finding things. And yet we know, you saw the figures. This is an area we really need to boost firefighters as well. Mm-hmm. They're not part of the conversation. We're talking about law enforcement, and firefighters also have law enforcement within them, but all of these factors that we're talking about, we're seeing much higher numbers in that group, apart from compassion fatigue, which we're seeing mostly in law enforcement. But that makes sense because they're dealing much more with people versus buildings, even though firefighters do too, particularly road crashes, etc. Mm-hmm. And when they're emptying out buildings, but we need more. And I think that from what I'm hearing, again, listening to what practitioners are telling me what we need, first responders, that includes our ambulance workers, the emergency management, on the ground people, and 911 responders. Mm-hmm. I'm hearing from several angles now how they're forgotten, and yet the trauma that they're experiencing when they're taking these calls, and then feeling responsible for sending officers to dangerous situations and not being able to help because they're left by the phone. And so I think that we need to enlarge our understanding about who is impacted by what. Not everybody is the same. We're all human beings, and human beings are impacted by adversity. And we all have the same human functions. So it's the basic things. But the situation, the context that we experience in it is very different, which is why it is so crucial for us to do this review and do all of these surveys to actually find out how are people experiencing adversity, what adversity are they experiencing, and how can we help?
Yeah, absolutely. I know here just in with the COVID crisis, the ongoing COVID crisis, that we look at exposures, predominantly in EMS workers, but also, corrections is a very hazardous environment when you're in close confinement, literal confinement, with a large number of people. And so I know in the case of EMS, kind of perceived and very real disparities in pay and benefits are kind of amplified, that feeling of being a second-class citizen among the first responders, and of course even more so for dispatchers or telecommunicators. And I think they're all getting some recognition, but I think it's encouraging, and I think it's very important to tie those things together, because in a sense, and that's one of the things that we came to in studying large-scale events at here at the Regenhard Center, was that, if you look at any disaster or large incident scene, right, you're seeing multiple responder roles working shoulder to shoulder, right? And so this notion that, oh, well, this was a very traumatic event for EMS, but not about the police officer who was standing right next to them, or this was terrible for the fire department, but not for the EMS workers who, picked up the firefighter who was injured. And then all cutting across all those, of course, dispatchers who are in many ways, they never have the resolution of being able to see what happens in the field, right? Or being able to resolve their concerns by at least, okay, now I've reached the person, I'm giving them help, they're in a better position. But all they got was the first part of the call, which was everything is terrible, get here in a hurry, and then it's on to the next call, right? And many times they don't always get closure. So we've got a couple more questions, and so let me look.
Just to follow up on that, actually.
Oh yes, yeah. I was going to say, oh yeah, this is the part where, you get to answer that. That was a question.
No, I'm not going to. I think you're in a situation that really, I would say, could have a tremendous impact, because I'm going in and looking at not necessarily when things are happening right now. I'm talking to people at different times in their lives, but normally when they're getting the positive training. Mm-hmm. You're in a situation where you're actually there when the negative adversity is happening and you're seeing it firsthand. I think that's a very different place to be. And I think connecting and the information that you're getting on the ground from people and seeing it happen when you're in emergency management would be a tremendous, I would say, input into this work, because you're really looking at it when it's happening. Mm-hmm. What is happening to people? How are they feeling it in the midst of dealing with the adversity? I get them when we're telling them about, how to become happy, how to increase their meaning, how to, shift their mindset. So it's different, even though, of course, I know about the trauma as well, and sometimes we're there, but that's not really our focus, because I'm a psychologist and you're in emergency management. So I think that, again, this is why I'm so thrilled to be joining you here today as part of the Regenhard Center, because I think that at John Jay, we have so many different resources and so many people who serve the same populations but have different skill sets and interactions, and together we can really provide that context to make a difference and have an impact.
Well, I think it's a ripe area, and I look forward to.
I just roped you into research. You notice?
Oh yeah. Let's see, and then of course this is. I think we've kind of addressed this, but it's an important question, and I think it'll resonate particularly with the practitioners. Is how much effort is going into addressing the causes of stress/burnout, and this question specifically calls out workload, but. I guess they're saying if we create a more resilient workforce, will that mean that senior management will try to further increase workload?
Interesting. I mean, organizational stress. Again, I'm talking for a number of different first responder groups. But if we just talk about law enforcement, just to take that as an example, they signed up to do certain things with their jobs. They signed up to be in danger. They signed up to help. They signed up to see trauma. And so, yes, sometimes there will be levels of compassion fatigue, definitely. However, this is what they signed up. It's just like the military as well, which is a group we haven't spoken of, but again, it's another group, right? What they didn't sign up for, like most of us, is the paperwork and the organizational red tape, the organizations not supporting them when they really need their support, the public not appreciating what they're doing, and not seeing all the positive sides, and so they're not getting that positive reinforcement. And so I do think that we need to. People are talking about it, but again, for there to be change, I'm a big believer. People are not going to try to get change unless they see the numbers that show them that they need the change. So if we're actually measuring these things, what it is that people, there is no research on burnout. It's incredible. And yet this is what we're seeing is really, this is how people disengage. And a lot of burnout is actually the difference between stress and burnout. A lot of the burnout, it's about you disconnect because you no longer feel that you can live your purpose and meaning. Most people who go into these fields, they're not going in they're going into because they want to help. They want to have an impact on their communities. If they're not allowed to do that, or if there's things that they feel stand in their way, and it's all about perception. Then you have you have both sides. Then that's going to lead to burnout. Stress is normal, and so stress is, that's just overwork. We have a lot. Just the workload and the sleep. People can work really hard if and they don't mind working hard. I see that people in my teams, if they know that if this fits into what they want to be doing, they're passionate about it and they want to make a difference. And I see this in all of our students who want to contribute. And it's the same with our first responders. They will do the hours. They will go over and beyond. But it's when they feel that they are put in a place where they can't live out their purpose and meaning. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that, and that's the paperwork, right? It's the paperwork, it's the pay, it's the hours, and it's all of those other organizational issues. So I do think that we need to deal with that. But before we can deal with it, let's figure out how many of them are feeling it. So once we have numbers, if we say, hey, look at this. This is how bad the issue is. But we don't have those numbers yet. Mm-hmm. We have a little bit, but not a lot. If we can really do a review of everything that has been done on this and even collect new data that is current right now with what people have to deal with, then we can really put that to management and hopefully have that conversation and say, well, what can we do? Because management still needs certain things. Everybody in that organization has needs. And so we need to make sure that we fulfill needs at all levels, the leadership level, the management level, and then the officers, and that everybody essentially get to engage in the way that allows them to feel that they are totally engaged with their jobs, able to do their jobs and what they signed up to do. And different people signed up to do different things.
Mm-hmm. Let's go a little further into that. And you intimated that a lot of it I would call administrative or bureaucratic stress as opposed to the operational stress. So let's just call it out in the field delivering service. Is that I guess you want to talk about that, and I know this is preliminary, but in terms of your findings to date, how much of this is the actual job versus all the organization, or maybe even the environment, the social and political environment that bears on their organization?
See, this is why we need to work together, because you're asking all the right questions. These are exactly the things that we're looking at. But we don't know yet, because I do believe this is why we're measuring all of these different things, because all of these things have different causes and they have different solutions. Mm-hmm. And so we need to understand how each one of these is impacting the mental health of our officers, be it stress, burnout, PTSD, depression, substance abuse, whatever else is going on, compassion fatigue. We need to understand the causes of that, or the context in which they're feeling it. We need to understand how much this is affecting their mental health. And then we need to understand, depending on what kind of resilience training they get. So out of, for example, the 4 tenets that we have, mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical, which one affects which one of these causes? Mm-hmm. And then so that we can tailor programs a lot better. Now, we don't have the numbers yet. We're still analyzing those because we only started the last project that we had back in March. Okay. Because we had to wait for, obviously, the resilience program to start. Right. But, and even then, we really have moved forward very, very quickly. But those are the exact questions that we need answering, because having that, in order for management or leadership to make a decision about where to put money from budgets, how to best support officers versus you want to support people in a way that is backed up by the evidence, so that you get more bang for your buck, mm-hmm. essentially, right? To put it plainly, but where you get the effect. So if you're not going to have a decrease in your budget right now in training, make sure you put it in the place where really it's going to have an impact. And for that to happen, we need the evidence base that shows what connects with what. So if you have this group of people who are feeling this need, this is the training that you need, because this is from the research tells us this is the thing that is going to have an effect, rather than just throwing a bunch of training at them and hoping mm-hmm. something will stick, which is a waste of everybody's time, right? And so I think that is really where we're at. And that's, I mean, that's the same approach I've taken to a lot of the work that I've done with law enforcement over the years, is not just on wellness, but on investigations, etc. It's that whole issue of let's identify the connections so that we can ask the right questions in order to get the right answers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm getting an endorsement here from one of the questioners in the audience. We don't. I hear you, and I think we're with you on that. And to continue, let's talk a little bit about because now the only way to keep me quiet, people out there, is to send a couple more questions in. We've got about 15 more minutes, so we'd love to have some more questions. Can you talk a little bit about social media? I mean, what I find, and this is just, this is not systematic, it's anecdotal, but there is people get into a mindset, and, they may be in an agency, and you typically would see this, and not to overgeneralize, but let's generalize. Some suburban, smallish agency, not a particularly difficult working environment, not to diminish any of that, but they're in some kind of a social media milieu where their diet consists of here's an officer in Los Angeles City getting assaulted, and here's body cam footage of somebody getting beaten up, and here's this and here's that, and that's their breakfast, right? That's like before they go down and have a bagel and coffee or whatever they're going to have that morning. Or even on the soft side of that, or the whole defund and everybody hates the police, right? And the police, they should be accustomed to that, but they aren't. And and it's funny because you're working in a public safety setting with law enforcement and fire. They want to be loved. They're used to be loved. It's a nonstop love fest, and the degree that stops, things are bad. Law enforcement less so, but it seems that a lot of and unfortunately, the way it's been drawn out is, post George Floyd, we had the upsurge in Black Lives Matter, and there was tremendous support for that. Some law enforcement leadership came out and embraced Black Lives Matter and tried to find common ground, and then that quickly got politicized or whatever, and it turned into it's anti-cop. And now we have this whole, I think, very unhealthy schism. And so we have this kind of social justice and equal treatment on one hand and support of law enforcement on the other. And so, and I think to some degree, fire and EMS have kind of been swept up in that to the degree they've got solidarity across the first responder workforce. What are your thoughts on that in terms of, does that contribute to stress? Is it constructive? Is it helpful? Or is it just is, and we have to figure out how to deal with it?
I mean, definitely. I mean, we've all felt it during COVID, right? Listening to all the negativity has had an effect on everybody, and it increases fear as well. And we know that just from general social psychology, that bad news just is bad news for people, essentially. Mm-hmm. Social media and the media and the way that law enforcement has been portrayed through that definitely has always been an issue in the media, but lately there has definitely been a lot of negativity at a time when negativity is really not needed in order to get things done. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't say it, and it doesn't mean that people don't feel it, and we should acknowledge people feeling things, definitely. But the increase in negativity and a negative narrative around everything has not made things easy across the board for many different groups. And I definitely think that is an issue. It is not something I am measuring, but I know that other people are. However, we are dealing with it because mental resilience is, I always say to people, when they said, oh, there's all of this stuff happening and my life is just awful and everybody hates me, and so I just want to quit and I'm just going to retire. And I say, yes, how you perceive the world. It doesn't even matter whether it's true or not. What matters is how you see it, because we can't stop all of this. And right now it is real. But the thing with adversity is we can't stop bad things happening to us. We're always going to have bad things. Now it's about the defunding, and it was a protest, and it was about there's always going to be another thing that we have to deal with. And so we can't change that. But what we can change is how we view it and how we choose to deal with that situation, how we choose to let it affect us. That is actually the core of mental resilience, is teaching people in the face of so much adversity coming from many different angles. And everybody has their own thing that affects them. And every one of those things is valid, because you can't argue with how someone feels. People feel, and because they feel it, it's valid. But what we can do is give people a sense of control back, where they can take their lives back and they have control over how they perceive the world and how they feel about it. And the basic techniques of mental resilience and even emotional resilience is that whole emotion, is the mindset, how we choose to perceive it, how we choose to reframe it, how we choose to see a situation of negativity as an opportunity for growth. I don't mean that in the tree hugging sense, but really in terms of, you see a problem, okay, well, what are you particularly good at? And that's when we then leverage into the spiritual social resilience, which is about connecting it with people's strength. What are you particularly good at? Now, if we identify what those things are, and we actually give people, like measurements to get that, and what is your value system? Take that, approach this situation with the strength versus with what challenges you, and see if you can tackle it. And these are all kind of tools that we deal with when we build up this resilience. What happens is that people realize that they have a choice. They can't control the world. And there's nothing that stresses us out more than feeling out of control and feeling that we can't change what is happening around us. But if we realize this, and we realize that what we can control and we can action that piece, then we're back in the driving seat again. And so it doesn't mean that the media and social media is not going to be negative. But what it means is that we can choose to react to it and understand why we react in certain ways as well. And then choose to reframe that situation in a way that's going to benefit us. And then that way, it's the impact of that situation. It's not going to go away, but the impact is going to be less. And that's mental resilience and emotional resilience right there. So it's I always say to people, it's amazing how we ended up doing this research and we didn't even realize it. Then literally on the train back and having finished the training of the first cohort that we dealt with, COVID hit. And all these things that we didn't bank on, but this is a perfect time to train people. It's a perfect time to see how people are dealing with it and how these resilience tools are actually working. So I think you're raising a very, very important point, because the national narrative in terms of law enforcement is challenging right now from many different angles. But it's about how do you approach that as an individual? How do you deal with it? Do you listen to the news? How do you react to it? How can you use that reaction to make changes rather than feeling that you are at the receiving end of negativity? What can you do? And so that's the basis. So that's how I would approach it, is really through resilience.
Well, I think that was, I think we're ending up in a great spot, and that was a great response. Let me just ask a fairly straightforward question and put out one last call for questions. And that would be, roughly how many officers and what ranks will have been through the program when you're finished, or to date? Or do you want to have, what's your number you're striving for?
Well, it depends, because we're doing many different research projects with
Okay.
different types of officers, different organizations, and even different groups. And the way I look at it is if we get to, so this is why I'm going to publish and get things out there like we're doing today. The research is not finished, and the numbers I've given, I don't want people to rely on these as the numbers.
Right.
But the problem is not going to go away. And so we need to tackle it as we go along with the research and feedback as we go along, then modify it accordingly. And so I'm just going to continue feeding back as soon as we finish each phase of the study with the many different organizations that we're working with, and whether we're doing training evaluation, whether we're doing resilience evaluation, whether we're looking at, developing, even just doing the review. I mean, the big thing that we're doing right now, over and above looking at what officers are doing, is understanding the context. We don't actually, whenever I've gone to a conference or a meeting and I ask the practitioners about what their knowledge is in this and what they need, the response is the same. They're like, we don't know what the problems are. We don't know the numbers so that we can react appropriately. Someone needs to give us the numbers, and that's what we're trying to do. So I think that definitely is the first step. And then as the numbers start coming out, I will be providing that both to the organizations, and then not just publishing in academic journals, but really getting it out in a way that people in practice can get access to this information and then make the decisions accordingly. And at least then the decisions are informed on what we know at that specific time. We can only ever make decisions on what we know right now. And that may change tomorrow and the next month. But right now, this is the best we have. Let's make a decision on that. And the next time we know a little bit more, now we can refine those decisions even more. And it's a continuing process. We just must never end that process, because it always goes on. It never finishes.
Right. Well, that was great. And I think we are closing in on the end of our time here. And so I just want to thank you, Gabrielle, for sharing your research and progress with us. And I think the model you put together is really exciting and encouraging. And, we'll talk offline about trying to go somewhere and find a suitcase full of money to expand this work. The one question, we have had a couple people ask about getting copies of your PowerPoint, and I know those are preliminary numbers in there, so I just figured I was going to do it offline, but since we've gotten like 4 questions, are you, we're going to release a stream of the talk, but are you okay with furnishing the slides?
So what I'm going to do is I'll prepare, because some of those aren't we have other numbers that we can share that actually provides a lot more detail.
Okay.
And if people can hang on for a couple of weeks, we're actually going to do the full thing, and I'm hoping to be able to share that. So we have the list of people who attended the session,
yes,
and then we can send that out, or we can, provide it a download somewhere for people. And then I want people to have the best information that they can if they're going to use it for whatever it is that they need to use it for. So I'm happy to share that. I mean, I'm doing this research to share it with people. I just want to make sure that we're sharing the right thing. So what I selected today was snippets of information. We have so much more. And even I spoke too much, even on snippets. This is academia all over again, isn't it? We have so much information, but we're doing a lot of work on this. And I do want to share it. So yes, I can share things. I won't share these slides, but I will share like a summary document that we'll put together for people.
Okay, great.
But so, anyway, they have this is going to be recorded, right?
Yes, so, yeah, this is recorded. This will be up on the Regenhard Center webpage, which is, you can get back to that through Eventbrite, christianregenhardcenter.org, or just Google it. There's only one. And so we'll have that up there, and we'll certainly be able to provide an update to everybody who had registered. And so as we finalize here, I just want to thank our attendees. I also want to thank the Office for Advancement of Research at John Jay, who facilitated our use of the software today. And lastly, I've got once again thank Gabrielle for being here with us and sharing her work. So thank you all. Be safe and get on our listserv, or keep an eye on our next events. In December, we'll be talking about the Oregon wildfires with the Director of Oregon Emergency Management, who also happens to be on the advisory board of the Regenhard Center. So we hope to see you then. And in the meantime, stay safe, wear your mask.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's been an honor, and for inviting me to be part of this. And I also want to thank our attendees to being part of this, and for those questions as well. This is all such important work, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people want to follow up with by just contacting us. So thank you so much again for having me partake in this series of webinars from the Regenhard Center.
All right, thank you. It was great, and thanks everyone. And so have a good day.